Hello, and welcome to this episode of It's Not You, but Sometimes It Is, the podcast of real leaders talking real talk about overcoming the real crap that we have had to endure as we rise into that C-suite role. And today's episode with Eric Lent is a lot of fun. He has this very unique perspective of bringing the sophistication of systems and strategy of a big corporation into small to medium sized companies, helping them transform, get more sophisticated, grow. And he shares a lot of wisdom in very practical, real world ways. So I know you'll enjoy it. Welcome and have a great time. All right, welcome, Eric. I'm really happy to have you here and talk with you today about your experience in your current role as COO of Gravity Haus, but also just generally, you've got a really interesting career trajectory. So I'm really excited to talk and have you share your wisdom with us.
Meg, excited to be here and hello to all your listeners.
So let's get oriented. Let's help other people catch up to what I already know. Can you give me a little bit of your path to your current role? What were some of those pivot points along your career path that led you to a C-suite role?
Oh gosh, it's interesting because there's been pivot upon pivot in my career. I've had the very good fortune of working across industries, different categories, different parts of the world. And the leader that I am today is a mosaic of all those experiences. I started my early career in marketing and consumer packaged goods, brands like the Hershey's, Reese's, Kit Kat, Glade, Drano, Kodak back when that was a brand. And it was interesting because early years in my 20s, I was given a P&L and accountability for a cross-functional team. In that period of my life, the team, generally speaking, were always more experienced than I was.
Hmm.
And so really helped me learn how to lead through influence. Second half of my career, I went into travel, leisure, and hospitality, largely guest-facing companies, everything from theme parks to the Harlem Globetrotters to hotels, right? Hotels around the world, US, China, Middle East, and did a few private equity gigs along the way, smaller companies, took the, big company skill set and applied that to smaller businesses. Massive learning there in terms of how to translate big company models into small company talent and resources. And then ended up with Gravity Haus a little over a year and a half ago now. And Gravity Haus is a business whose purpose is to provide our members and guests, insiders, access to the ultimate adventure lifestyle. It was a business that was born just prior to the pandemic. And coming out of the pandemic, society had a bigger need for connection and community, immersion in nature,
Hmm.
and health and wellness. And those are pillars of our brand. And so we're a portfolio of hotels in the coolest mountain destinations in the US. Think Aspen, Jackson Hole, Vail. We just announced Big Sky yesterday. And then we have a member social club on top of that, where part of my job is to create programming to allow our members to get that insider's access. And that's everything from a supper club in the outdoors to a hut to hut backcountry ski trip.
Awesome. Awesome. That's exciting. It sounds like your career, with all the little pivots, you've had a diverse experience that actually really sets you up for being in an industry that combines different kinds of services and needs. So I see that a lot with people who end up in executive and C-suite roles, is that they have a uniquely diverse experience that helps them to lead something new and innovative, which is really fun.
When I give counsel to younger professionals on career management, I try to blow up this idea of climbing the corporate ladder. And I try to cement the visual of think of your career as circling a mountain and try to get lateral experiences in different areas. So when you ultimately get to a senior executive role, you have an empathy and appreciation for other
Mhm.
functions
Yeah.
that allows you to actually influence and negotiate across an organization.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that metaphor. So I'm interested, in your perspective. You've brought the sophistication of bigger corporations into smaller businesses that, many of us have experience in small to medium-sized businesses as not being very sophisticated, and that causes people problems, cultural friction. So I'm curious if you could give us an example of where you came into a smaller company and saw a gap in culture and the way that it was functioning. What was the solution you brought, and how did that impact the experiences of the employees?
Sure. I'm laughing, but when I went through this experience, it was quite daunting for me. So my first role outside of global multinational companies, I stepped into a mid-sized company. And in my prior role, I had accountability for creating best practices on how to build a business, build a brand, and drive growth around the world. Right. And I benchmarked companies like Samsung, Marriott, Procter and Gamble. So I got the best of the best on how to get it done. And I went to this company and I had about 80 marketers in a meeting. And I gave this impassioned speech about how we're going to build a brand and drive growth and steal market share. And the entire audience had like these headlight eyes or blank stares. And I had this moment, like I realized that what I was saying was not resonating.
Mhm.
Probably they didn't even understand what I was talking about. And it was, in some ways it was self-humiliating to me because I went in there a little arrogant, right? Had the answers, but it was such a jarring experience that it really, in so many ways I'm thankful for it because it helped me realize that you have to have the agility to adapt what you know to different levels of experience, different
Mhm.
levels of acumen, different levels of financial resources. So a very tough lesson for me to learn, but enormously helpful for the rest of my career.
Yeah. So I'm always surprised at how insular different kinds of jobs and professions can be, where you don't really understand the nature of business. You're like, no, I just do this. I create software programs, or I'm a graphic designer, right? And they don't understand how to align with a bigger strategy, when actually, once they realize how they're contributing to something really meaningful and bigger than themselves, it's very engaging. So I imagine coming in and helping to build the awareness and skill of people who just felt like they were marketers, right? And help them to see, no, you're such an important part of this really big, exciting thing we're doing. They probably got a little more motivated.
One of my leadership principles, I call it, I say communication is key. Early, often, up, down, sideways. And I agree with you. In fact, here at Gravity Haus, we're a business that is migrating from a startup to a scale up, right? In
Mhm.
a startup, you throw a bunch of things at the wall. People have fire in the belly. They have this get it done attitude. But as the business is growing and we're professionalizing, the need to understand a role, I believe people need to understand their role in contributing to the greater good of the company. And so I am very transparent, and I'm doing this right now, actually, of trying to educate the organization on the P&L, the financial situation with the
Yeah.
company. So as they're making strategic decisions, spending decisions, priorities on their to-do list, they're doing it within the context of what we're trying to achieve as a total company versus I've got to get this project done or here's my deadline.
Yeah, absolutely. So Eric, I'm also curious. We always have real talk on this podcast so that people can understand the types of challenges that people have been through, and how what they learned from it. So can you give us an example of you coming into a company or a setting and trying to implement a change, and it ended up really pissing people off, or creating friction, or just some kind of unknown barrier where you had a vision for what you wanted to do and it did not go as planned? What was one of those really tough situations you've been through, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, it's I'll talk about a story. It didn't turn out the way we thought, but it was actually good for the company. So I worked for a confectionery company years ago, one of the biggest ones on the planet, and we had made a decision as a business to globalize because 96% of the sales were coming out of the US and Western Europe. And so so the CEO and COO asked me to create a business model to allow the company to scale into the interior of the emerging market economies. So, think about, 5 hours north of the center of India, where the electricity in the entire town would go on and off at the same time. And I was given this role, and when I was given the role, Meg, like literally the hair in the back of my neck stood up because I was like, I have no idea how to even approach this. And the company was built to cater to the modern trade. The modern trade in retail is, think about it, big factories,
Mhm.
to big warehouses, to big fleets of trucks that distribute to the Walmarts, the Targets, the Carrefours, and Tesco's of the world, right?
With a
And
reliable supply chain.
yeah, and refrigerated trucks, right?
Yeah.
And on a numerical basis, on the number of stores in the world, 93% are actually called the traditional trade. And these are the bodegas in Mexico, the 4.4 million kiosks in India,
Mhm.
the sari-saris, the favelas in Brazil, and everything melts, like
Mhm.
chocolate melts. And so I did a piece of research where we analyzed the distributors that got to the interior of all these countries. So I went to all these countries, lived in them for weeks on end, and we actually learned how the business in this part of the world works. It was so different from the way this company was set up to operate.
Okay.
And so there was friction within the company about being able to create a chocolate that has a high melt point,
Hmm.
um, build a new distribution model that was different than big, 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 right? This wasn't about scale. This was about volume or unit volume. Um, and then the margins weren't great,
Hmm.
but you sold so many that it actually made up for what you lost in margin. And so it's really presenting an entirely different model to the company. Now, the CEO of the company, thankfully, was a champion of this, and he was rated one of the top five CEOs in the U.S. by Fortune magazine at the time, and he helped me champion the initiative. Uh, that executive sponsorship is the only thing that enabled this initiative to see success. We ultimately ended up scaling into over 300,000 bodegas in Mexico. We went into all the favelas, those lower income neighborhoods in Brazil, and then scaled it to China as well. But for me, the learning was if you're driving a massive change management initiative where there's the potential for friction organizationally, you have to have that executive sponsorship.
Right. Right. Yeah. Interesting. So, um, let's talk about, in your role as a COO and you're leading these cross-functional teams in multiple settings, right? With people from different industries and backgrounds, where your job is basically bring people together, create the right environment for them to be able to collaborate well and adapt to change. And so you have to understand people to some perspective. Whereas sometimes someone at the CEO level doesn't need to understand culture and people as much as a COO. So, or at least that's been my experience in mid-sized companies. So can you give me an example of where you've seen this quote play out? And the quote being culture eats strategy for breakfast, where you had great goals and plans, and then the culture totally got in your way, and how did you overcome it?
Well, I'm gonna flip my answer because I believe, and I've seen it time and again, that the strength of a culture can actually, regardless of what your strategy is, can help you achieve success.
Yeah.
And so I worked for IHG Hotels and Resorts for a chunk of my career,
Mhm.
and I was asked to take on the turnaround of Crown Plaza. Now, Crown Plaza had been challenged as a brand from a performance standpoint, a financial standpoint, a growth standpoint. And I took on the role, and it was about 6 weeks before the annual franchise owners meeting.
Mhm.
And the IHG Owners Association, which is the governing body that represents the franchisees, sent a letter to us. It was like a four-page white paper talking about concerns over the trajectory of the business.
Mhm.
And gosh, and it was a harsh letter, right? And it created enormous anxiety in me because I had to present this strategy in a month and a half. And I ended up locking myself in my office with a couple of finance guys and strategy people and cranked out a plan. We got approval by CEO and the board to fund the plan at a pretty significant investment amount. And I delivered the speech to the owners. And as I'm delivering the speech, Meg, again, maybe there's a pattern with me, angry faces. And when you deliver these speeches to franchisees, you're supposed to stick to a script because everything could be used, for or against you, right? Um, I went off script and I stepped on the edge of the stage and I looked at all these owners and I said, I know that your daughter's college education, your retirement, your financial expectations are all wrapped up in these hotels, and I'm pledging to all of you, I will do whatever I can to help these assets perform. And after that meeting, some owners came up and gave me a hug. Others came up to me and wagged their finger in my face and said, "You better deliver. I'm holding you accountable," which I was fine with. But then the cool thing, Meg, is I was given a chance to build a team to deliver. And I recruited for grit, intellectual curiosity, agility, teamwork or collaboration, and leadership, right? Because I have found in my career, if you get an individual with those qualities, you get a high performing individual. When you get a team like that,
Mhm.
magic happens. And as we built this team, it was the chance to create a culture. And together we built a culture of, we called it absolute ownership, meaning no matter where a problem was, anywhere in the business, we all felt a shared accountability for solving it. We agreed there would be no finger pointing,
Mhm.
and we pledged to operate as a high functioning, high trust team.
Mhm.
3 years later, me and my team stood on that same stage and pointed to the highest increases in revenue per average room in 10 years,
Mhm.
the highest increases in guest satisfaction in 5 years, and the highest increases in franchise owner satisfaction any brand anywhere in the world for
Wow.
IHG. Standing ovation from the owners at that conference. And we had a strategy, but it was the culture that drove the performance.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people confuse the word culture and are not quite sure what we mean by that. And your culture has to align with the strategy or the goal at hand, right? And so it was really clear when you're doing a turnaround, you have to have people that have full ownership but they're also agile, right? And curious. So you picked your cultural elements. Here's our focus. Here's how we do things. And I'm hiring people that have those values. And then they're able to align with the big task at hand because they know how to show up in a way that's going to foster that big vision.
I agree with you. And part of this work was changing the perception of the brand internally at the company. And so one of the things that we did, my communications lead, who's great idea, is every quarter we printed out like a business card. And on the front of the business card were the four pillars of the strategy.
Mhm.
On the back of the business card were the key messages of how we were making progress within that quarter.
Hmm.
And the job of the entire team was if you're in an elevator, if you're on a call, you're in a meeting, you got to drop these comments, right? And so all of a sudden you had 70 people that were speaking the same message internally.
Hmm.
And it was so effective that, even the CEO in the analyst calls started quoting some of the stuff that we were touting because of the effectiveness that the team was showing.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So implementing it with everyone really aligned, aware, and really intentional around it. That's cool. That's fun. A lot of people don't get the chance to do that, Eric.
No,
So,
it's funny because it was an incredibly hard challenge, but so incredibly rewarding.
mhm,
You know,
yeah,
I look back on that, it was probably one of the most formative experiences of my career.
absolutely. So, okay, let's shift gears and talk about those not as rewarding times where there's there's friction, but not in a good way, right? And just unnecessary drama. I have seen the impact of bad bosses or poor leadership on a lot of companies as well. I'm sure you have. As you've been turning things around, you've seen behaviors from leaders that totally erode culture that you've been intentional about creating. So, what is your definition of a bad boss, and are they fixable?
Gosh, I don't know if there's one definition,
Okay.
truly, what I will say is, if in prior experience I've had or have had others tell me about, there's I call it sharp elbows, right? There's some people who have been very successful because they've built teams, they've driven growth, all the right things. There are others who get to a certain point in their career where they've achieved success, but they do it because they have sharp elbows and leave a wake of bodies
Mhm.
behind them. What's interesting is I find that persona ultimately taps out,
Right.
right? They hit a ceiling and they can't go further because as you get more senior in your career, your success is only enabled by what you can get done through others,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Yeah.
so it's also, one of the things I've also recognized is when you see this kind of adverse behavior in senior leaders, it's usually rooted in some type of trauma or self-esteem
Hmm.
or lack of belief in themselves that manifests itself in a bit of a defense mechanism outwardly, right? And that's, I saw that early on in my career very significantly to the point where I actually went to the CEO and said, I'm going to resign if you're going to allow this behavior to continue, on this team.
Right. Right. Yeah. I was talking with one of my clients a couple days ago and said, what you need to realize is when people are doing really toxic, dysfunctional things and they're senior leaders, I want you to picture them as a really hurt, afraid child in an adult's body, right? Because we've got this old stuff. Everyone's got their traumas. Some of us overcome them, and some of us get derailed completely, and it creates this deep-rooted insecurity. So usually those behaviors of bad leaders all stem from insecurity
Yeah,
and their inability to handle it, manage it, be aware of it, and overcome it, and still show up in a way that's intentional and professional.
yeah, and I do think it is fixable.
Mhm.
Like I have
Yeah.
seen, and I've had people that I've had to coach where, I remember one guy early on, he was smart young man, terrible working with others. And I had to put him on a performance improvement plan. I said, I'm going to give you 90 days. I said, my expectation is at the end of these 90 days, you and I are going out to dinner celebrating your change.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm putting out there. That's what I want you to fulfill. And he did. Like he corrected himself. And he's had a very successful career. So I do think it can be coached up.
It's just, I think people don't realize that it really is a lack of skill and managing yourself, being aware of your crap that you're bringing, and then being able to then manage relationships well. It's a skill, and when someone's motivated to learn it, they do. And that's how you fix a bad boss, right?
Yeah, this is going to sound very cliche, but that whole concept of putting yourself at the bottom of the org chart, like servant leadership, that to me, like for me, becoming the executive that I am today, I started doing that early on,
Mhm.
and it created a pressure in me. Like if I'm at the bottom of the org chart, how do I help and serve others in a way that they can be successful, because their success would beget my success, right? And that's that I can't remember if I read it or learned it or somebody coached it into me, but that's been hugely impactful to my career personally. Is if you're in the business of serving the organization,
Mhm.
what can you do as a leader to help the rest of that organization be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Is how can they help me be successful from the top, right?
yeah, yeah. A lot of what you said is flipping paradigms upside down today. You tend to think of it this way, but if you turn it upside down or flip it around, it tends to be a little more constructive. I think there's a lot of we've all kind of believed a bunch of crap we were taught by people leading in a different paradigm that was much more traditional that really doesn't work. And a lot of leadership is learning to unbelieve some of the things that you were taught by other leaders. So on that note, Eric, I would love to close with you sharing advice that you would give to that up and coming smart 30-year-old who wants to end up in a COO role. What advice would you give them?
So I'm going to tell a story from when I was a teenager. When I was 17 years old, I was living New York metro area, and I cut school for the day and went to New York City. And I spent the day with a cousin of mine who was an account supervisor at an advertising agency. And he set up a day of informational interviews. So I met with the strategy team, the creative team, the media team. And at the end of the day, he talked about how his job was the hub of the wheel. And I had stars in my eyes, like I want to do this. And he said to me, look, if you truly want to do this, don't major in advertising, don't major in communications, major in business. And this is where it gets important, because the only way you're going to add value to a client or to an organization is if you strive to understand their business better than them. And that one sentence has carried me throughout my entire career. When I come into a new team, when I come into an organization, I over invest on trying to understand the history, trying to understand the legacy, trying to understand the personalities,
Mhm,
so that so I'm coming in with a really broadened empathy
mhm,
for how to drive change. And that would be my advice is you do have to invest your personal resources in learning and understanding in whatever business you're in to be an effective leader.
awesome. Love it. Eric, thank you. Thank you again for coming and sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, Meg, my pleasure. Thank you.